A sincere thanks to Dr. Pat Miranda, to University of British Columbia, to the PAFC dash. People really like their titles. For inviting me, for bringing me out, for coordinating, for hosting. This is certainly a topic I'm very passionate about, and about doing research with, but also about translating it, sharing what we learn for many different audiences, for people living with autism, family members, service providers, as well as, of course, other researchers. So within the next 2.5 weeks, I basically get to do all of that depending on where I'm standing. So let's jump right in, because I have you for the next hour and a half or hour and 20 minutes, and hopefully to convey to you my passion and to convince you that we all have a role to play in promoting mental health for people on the spectrum in one way or another. You don't have to be a chair or a clinical psychologist, which I'm both. We all have an opportunity to support people on the spectrum when it comes to the topic of mental health. So how do we do it? I'm going to convince you, hopefully, by the end of this talk, that we can consider a framework that takes into account the individual needs and opportunities for working with any one individual when we understand them best, as well as taking into account the importance of understanding their contexts, plural, their ecologies, the kinds of societies that they grow in and develop in, that they shape and that shape them. So there are frameworks out there within outside of the autism world that we can capitalize on. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, that we can start with to help us guide how we pick the most effective treatments and study those treatments and ensure that they're adapted in the right way to suit people across the life course, across the spectrum, and across different levels of functioning. So we're going to talk about some examples. I'm going to show you some examples of ways we do this when we focus on the individual as the target of the intervention, when we focus on the family as a target of the intervention, or the broader context of interpersonal people in a person's life, or if we even consider the broader community as the target of intervention. All right, this is as a psychologist, I have to start with prevalence rates or some type of percentages, or they take my license away. So let's start with that. This is also kind of, unfortunately, when you're writing a grant application, you have to talk about the significance of why an agency should give you money for your research. Unfortunately, this is an easy paragraph for me to write. The fact is that regardless of how you do the research, whether you survey and questionnaires, whether you do detailed interviews, whether you do both, whether you do small studies or large studies, the pattern remains the same, even though the numbers, they might change from here to there. And that is that if you're on the autism spectrum, you're far more likely than the general population to at some point experience emotional or behavioral problems, in addition to core difficulties that might be associated with autism. When you do psychiatric interviews, the rates are about 70% of children and adolescents on the spectrum will meet criteria for an associated kind of condition, that is an anxiety disorder or depression or obsessive compulsive disorder, etc. So it's really more the rule than is the exception to the rule. And again, even when people will go back and say, well, maybe you're double coding, maybe you're counting a person's difficulties that have to do with their autism for a mental health issue. Maybe we should revisit your numbers. We do find when we take that extra step that the rates are maybe not as high as 70%, but rates are still far higher than in the general population. But the topic of mental health and mental health problems is not a topic exclusive to autism. There's been some excellent research out there done, especially from the UK, that's tried to understand rates in a population way where they love their census in the UK. Okay, their long-form census. You think our long-form census is long? Forget about it. Their long-form census is great, and they really go into a lot of detail, including to understand the needs of children and adolescents. So in looking at over 18,000 children across the UK, they were able to identify which children, according to at least parent report, have significant levels of emotional and behavioral difficulties. They looked at many different kinds. This is just an example of a few of them. And what you might see here is that the first red, the smallest red column, which starts at 19% or 22% or 18%, depending on the kinds of things you're asking about, have to do with kids who don't have autism and don't have an intellectual disability. That's the ID one. They were able to zoom in and say, of the 18,000 kids, which kids have autism, which kids have an intellectual disability, which kids have both autism and an intellectual disability, and which kids don't. And what are the rates of mental health issues like? And what you can see here is that in the general population, according to at least Parent Report, about 1 in 5 kids in the UK will struggle in a considerable way with emotional or behavioral difficulties, right? So this story of mental health is really one, in mental health care, is one that's important for every child, for every adolescent. Right? It's also something that if we look at the other bars, we see different numbers, different rates, but all 3 other bars are far higher than that general population statistic, right? Whether we're talking about 63% or 84% or 46%. The fact is that if you have the next one, the kind of the darkest one, is kids in the UK who have autism without an intellectual disability. The orange one is kids who don't have an autism, but they have intellectual disability. And the last one you can see is if kids have both autism and an intellectual disability. And in fact, regardless of whether you have autism or another kind of developmental disability, you're far more likely than in the general population to struggle with the same kinds of emotional and behavioral difficulties. Right? So the story is not just about autism, but part of the question is, why do children and adolescents who have particular neurodevelopmental vulnerabilities or challenges experience greater mental health issues? It's not just about kids either. Right? This is some research that's coming out that we're publishing just now. It's coming out probably next month, where we were able to look at Ontario health insurance data. So the entire population of Ontario, our kind of health card, our OHIP card, whenever you go and use that at your doctor's or you go to the emergency department, right, it gets swiped and it gets logged. It gets collated together in administrative health data. And we're able to identify which young adults, 18 to 24 years of age, had a code of any kind of autism spectrum in their health file, which had a code of another kind of developmental disability like Down syndrome or Fragile X syndrome. Right? And we're able to compare those two groups to a randomly selected group of 20% of young adults in Ontario, and that comes out to 393,000 young adults. Okay? So we're able to compare these groups on other kinds of codes in their health data, like how many psychiatric diagnoses have they received in their codes? How many difficulties have they received, are noted in their codes, in their DSM codes, in their ICD codes, in terms of substance-related or addictive disorders? How many times did they go to the emergency department for psychiatric issues in the last year? Or how many times have they been hospitalized for psychiatric issues in the last year? As just some examples of the kinds of things we could look at. And what we showed in this kind of data really parallels some of the other rates, which is that people, young adults, with identified ASD in their administrative health file are more likely to have at least one psychiatric diagnosis compared to those with other developmental disabilities. And those with other developmental disabilities are more likely to have at least one psychiatric diagnosis compared to the general population of young adults. Right? In many ways, young adults with autism are very similar to their peers with other developmental disabilities, except for actually when it comes to mental health care service use, being hospitalized for psychiatric reasons, going to the emergency department for psychiatric reasons, as well as in terms of just overall psychiatric rates. It's not just about anxiety either. Probably as a clinician, the number one thing when people know I do work with mental health and autism that I get referred to for is, can you help this person? They're having trouble with anxiety. And what we've learned is that anxiety is really the tip of the iceberg. When we talk about mental health, sure, of course, experiences of anxiety and the emotion anxiety is important to consider. But you know, anxiety and other kind of negative emotions go hand in hand often. Right? Anger and sadness, for example, are two sides of the same coin. We know that when we do lots of different kinds of research, if you rate very highly in terms of anxiety, you're more likely to also rate very highly in terms of depression or very highly in terms of difficulties managing anger. Okay? And this is something that's very common that we're seeing when we're considering autism, is that when we see one, we often see another. When people meet criteria for one psychiatric condition, they also typically meet criteria for another one. In fact, 80% of kids with autism that will meet criteria for attentional difficulties, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, will meet criteria for another psychiatric issue, typically an anxiety disorder. Okay? Now, whether they are struggling with those, we don't want to get into the weeds of how do you assess and how do you diagnose It's really not about the number here. It's about the pattern that I hope to convince you of. Now, let's move beyond percentages. No more percentages for a while, I promise. So, what explains these high rates? Well, there's this really smart group of people led by Jeffrey Wood from UCLA who suggested that people with autism go through their daily lives experiencing a number of ASD-related stressors. These are not necessarily major acute traumatic situations that happen, although those certainly do happen more likely for people with vulnerabilities like ASD. They suggested there are four kind of classes. The first is that people with autism experience greater social confusion, have to navigate a social world, very complex social worlds that might be more unpredictable for them, more stressful for them, and experience more challenge related to that, the day-to-day social interaction that might not be familiar. The second is that people with autism are more likely to experience bullying or other kinds of interpersonal violence. We know that adults with autism are more likely to experience being robbed, for example, and report higher rates of sexual victimization than in the general population. So there's a story here of interpersonal violence experience that's very common for people on the spectrum, as well as even not necessarily overt bullying, but the experience of social rejection that can happen when you care about being connected and you make an effort to be connected and you struggle to do so. There's many opportunities on a day-to-day basis where you can experience isolation. The third is not being able to engage in the kind of things that interest you, the things that are pleasurable for you, right? If you have a particular unique interest and you want to talk about plumbing all the time, and you want your world to be about plumbing, and it's something that you enjoy, but you have to go and do math, right? And the teacher's not going to be framing that in a topic that you really want to engage with. You're being withheld from engaging in something that's pleasurable for you. Okay? And in that way, it's inadvertent, it's kind of punishment, right? And these are daily things that might be unavoidable. That might just be, that's life. But the fact is that life involves these daily hassles, these small things that chip away. And lastly, thinking about a model building like this, which has taken such great care at ensuring that the sensory environment is one that is autism friendly, the world's not designed in that way, not yet at least. So if you are experiencing hypersensitivities to sensory issues, and you're going through a world that is not taking that into account, you have to manage that on a daily basis. So Wood and colleagues suggested that these kind of clusters of daily hassles, if you have a lot of them, you're more likely to experience anxiety, you're more likely to experience negative affectivity in general, right? Poor mood. I know I would if I was experiencing all of these daily hassles, day in, day out over years and years. And if I were to experience that, I might have other consequences of those kinds of emotions. The first is that if I felt social anxiety, I might withdraw even more from a social world. I might try to stay away from my social world. I might also engage in things that calm me down, right? Engage in my perseverations, engage in those topics that are interesting to me, essentially display more symptoms of autism. I might get my needs met in other ways if I can't communicate it in an assertive way, right? By getting angry, by showing that anger physically. Okay? Or I might have a poor quality of life, experience hopelessness. And if you had those greater ASD symptoms and more social withdrawal, then that loops back and causes greater ASD-related stressors. And around we go. So is there any question as to why people with ASD might experience greater mental health issues? I'm going to not go through this kind of table in detail. This is one that I try to teach when I'm teaching, like at UBC. I ask clinicians to consider different contexts, different ways of thinking about problems. We can consider biological contributions, psychological contributions, and social contributions. And this is common not just to autism, but in the general population. We're trying to understand mental health issues. There's often many levels to what might trigger or maintain or continue or put somebody at risk for mental health problems. And the same kinds of issues are at play whether you have autism or not. It just so happens that many times people with autism experience more of those vulnerabilities. Within the broader idea of health, it's not just about mental health. The World Health Organization and others, who I blatantly ripped this off from, talk about how a developing child does so within a context of child-level determinants, family-level determinants, community level determinants, and broader societal level determinants. That is, we all grow not in isolation, not as an island of one, or even as an island that's affected by our family, but we grow within multiple spheres. So the ingredients that go into those spheres are things we need to consider. So we need to optimize the child, the family, the broader community, and consider how we optimize society at large if we're going to address an issue like health. But let's move beyond a deficit-focused approach. So far, I've been pretty bleak, haven't I? I've been pretty negative. I started with rates of mental health issues and struggles, and that's an important part of the story, but it's not the entire story. In the last 5 years, one thing I've learned, and what I learned and what people with autism taught me, is that to really talk about mental health, we have to talk about mental health promotion. So, is the absence of mental health problems the same thing as good mental health? I would suggest no. If I were to ask you right now to describe to me, and you don't have to shout it out, but think to yourself how you would describe your mental health. Would you say that you're mentally healthy because you only meet 4 out of 8 criteria for depression? Or you have a T-score of 63 on a child behavior checklist, not a T-score of 65 or 66? Probably not. You probably wouldn't even talk if you're describing your mental health in terms of a lack of anxiety. That's why you're mentally healthy. You probably would talk about some terms like, I'm going to guess here, maybe belonging, or flexibility, or taking it day by day, or trying your best. Or, there are the other terms, happiness, right, that you might use to describe your mental health. There's many different ways, but a lack of symptoms is probably not top of your list. Yet in this field, when we think about mental health, we go straight to, and I went straight to, those problems. And they're important, but they're not the whole story, not if we really want to achieve good mental health. Positive outcomes cannot be defined solely by negative constructs. We have to figure out a way of talking about positive outcomes that go when we're boosting positive experiences, positive variables, positive constructs. And you know what? That's not actually as hard as we might think. There's a role for positive psychology, and there's a huge field, decades of research on positive psychology in people without autism that we're just starting to kind of focus now and consider when it comes to people with neurodevelopmental conditions, including autism. About a decade ago, Elizabeth Dykins from Vanderbilt, was a real mentor, somebody I aspire to, I really admire her work, her vision, proposed and observed more broadly around developmental disabilities that in almost the entire field was negative, was pathology-based, was deficit-based, right? And she said, well, why don't we think about things like what Seligman's been talking about, right? That understanding what's wrong with people only tells us so much about how to contribute to what people do well. What about things like happiness, she suggested, or flow? Do you guys know what flow is? I know you might not ever kind of know the term, but you've experienced flow.
This is the West Coast.
You're right. You guys know flow, right? So being engrossed in an activity where time flies by, where you're re-energized by the activity, right? Again and again, right? How, even describing it like that, and if you know autism at all, you might say, flow, maybe there's something we need to consider here, something worth talking about. But nobody has really researched it in that way. And we know that these kinds of constructs, thriving is another one that I'll share with you that we did a little bit of research on. We know that these constructs in the non-autism world are associated with success, better problem solving, improved learning and achievement, better health, longevity in many different ways. So we have an opportunity here to consider all the negatives, but also how do we develop interventions that promote the positive? Here's a framework that guides a lot of my research, and that's Richard Lerner's framework on positive youth development. I'm not going to go through all of the technical definitions in detail, but suffice it to say that Lerner and his colleagues suggest a couple of things. They suggest that, I'm going to try to make this red. Let's see, does it work? Do you guys see a red dot? Yes. On the red dot? So I'll go back and forth, I promise. Okay? So I can't actually look down and look up at the same time. So forget about that. So he suggests 2 kind of major starting points. It's that every individual brings with them a certain degree of internal intrinsic strengths. Okay? Intentional, what they describe of as intentional self-regulation. So that is really, without going to kind of the jargon, the skill sets, the goals, and the ability to reach those goals and adapt to reach those goals in a number of different domains. You might have strengths in your cognition, you might have strengths in your academics, in your social domain, in physical domains, in emotional domains. We all bring this at a certain developmental level to the world. But these kind of individual strengths are aligned with, they fit in some way, some better than others, with a person's ecologies, with external assets, external strengths. Right? A child doesn't develop on their own without the contributions of those external environments. And it's not just about the environment, it's not just about what the child brings, but it's about the alignment or the fit between the two. And Richard Lerner's work is focused on how that alignment fosters what he calls the 5 or 6 C's of positive youth development. And if you come up with a C, you can add your name to Richard Lerner's next citation. I made that up. You're not allowed, you can't do that. But I encourage you to think about another C. I already know what my 7th would be, but we'll talk afterwards about what that might be. So the 5 major C's is that when you have this kind of alignment between the environments and a person, the right fit between the two. So it doesn't mean everybody has to be awesome in their individual strengths. It's about finding the right fit between what person needs and what they're awesome at and what the environment brings in. When you have that, people thrive. And they thrive because they grow in terms of their confidence, their competence to do things, how they care for others and how they experience caring, their connections and belonging to society, and more broadly, their character, their moral development. And when you get more of these C's, then all of a sudden you start to contribute to yourself in positive ways, to your family, and to eventually society as civic-minded individuals. And they've done very strong longitudinal research, not with autism, just in the general population in the US, with thousands and thousands of children developing, looking at these trajectories over time. And we also know that if you don't experience a lot of these C's, a lot of these opportunities, you're more likely to also develop internalizing and externalizing issues like anxiety or anger issues or depression or comorbid kind of issues like that. These things aren't mutually exclusive. You can thrive and also have an anxiety issue at the same time, but they are associated to each other. Okay? So we did a study where we said, okay, can we even measure thriving in people with autism and people with intellectual disabilities who don't have autism? If we asked parents to fill out some questionnaires, we asked them questions about the thriving, these C's, how would they answer? Would they say, yeah, my child does connect to others. My child does contribute to our larger family. Right? Or would they say, this is not applicable to my family? How dare you ask these kinds of questions? You need to walk in my shoes. What are they going to say? So what did they say? So we asked them questions about this, and we've published it kind of a couple years ago now. It feels just like yesterday, where we were able to measure and figure out why do people with autism thrive, who thrives, okay, at least according to their parents' report. Okay, lots of limitations to this survey kind of research, but it was the first kind of attempt to even measure these things and look at mechanisms related to these 6 C's that you see here. So what did we find? Without getting into too much detail, we found that kids with autism, these were all people who participated in Special Olympics. They all had an intellectual disability, and they were all involved in this sport organization. Okay? It's not the general population, it's not necessarily representative. But what do we find is that in those athletes in Special Olympics, those with autism, a lot of them, hit these C's. Parents said, yeah, my child is connected. About almost up to 90% of the parents said, yes, my child is connected to other people, to their family members, etc. Yes, they do show caring, right? They are empathetic, and they experience sympathy and show sympathy. Right? For many people in the room, this is probably, of course, kind of things, right? There were other ways, though, that people with autism, according to their parents in the study, did not thrive as well. Okay, in some of these other ways, like developing confidence, right? Or in terms of competence, experiences of competence. And overall, as a mean, as an average, the group wasn't thriving. The group with autism wasn't thriving as much as their peers with intellectual disability. And why? There's a couple of things that we were able to measure and looked at, individual things and environmental things. So why do you think? Was it all about the person? Well, I kind of told you already, it's not all about the person. There were some things, those kids with autism struggled more in terms of their social communication skills, which makes sense, they have autism. And if they struggled more in that way, it's harder for them to thrive. But they also participated less in meaningful home activities and meaningful school activities. And that explained a lot of the reason why those kids with autism were thriving less. It wasn't what was in the person. It wasn't just one kind of thing. It was these meaningful kind of social activities that mattered. Okay? Now, there's lots of limitations to that work that we're going to pretend don't exist for the rest of the study, just for time's sake. So let's move on to what we can do about it for the last, hour or so. Okay? So let's first talk about the individual, then we'll move to the family and peer group, and then to community and society. And think to yourself, where do you already play a role? I bet you are somewhere in the next hour. Okay? So in any one domain, we might struggle, we might have a strength. Right? And it might be our relative strength, relative to our other challenges even. So let's talk about some of these as examples, what we can do about it. So first of all, if somebody has mental health issues, there's lots that we can do if you have autism, and at least for children. There's lots of manuals that exist now, tons of manuals that different people have put together. I'm proud to say I've never actually published a manual. I just use other stuff that other people use. There's a lot out there already. Whether you're a child, an 8-year-old, and you like spy-themed things, or you're a 14-year-old and you want to participate in a group environment. There are individual interventions, group interventions. Some interventions say they're specifically cognitive behavior therapy for anxiety, for autism. Other ones are manuals that exist for any child who's struggling with an emotional difficulty, and they've been adapted successfully for autism. So you don't even need to have an autism-specific intervention. You just need to know how to devise a way to make that accessible to the person that is in front of you. So there's lots of evidence to show that we can use things like cognitive behavior therapy to improve a person's well-being. Right? There's a systematic review that was recently published from the UK again that found 48 studies that use cognitive behavior therapy in some way with people with autism across the lifespan. Of those 48 studies, 24 of them involved CBT, so that's using a specific type of therapy to help a person around their emotions. The other 24 had to do with things like boosting social skills or vocational skills, life skills, things like that. Most of the studies involved children or adolescents, although some involved adults. 15 of the 24 studies were group-based, so we have a nice mix of group and individual kinds of interventions. 19 of the 24 studies focused on anxiety specifically, even though I've convinced you now already that it's not just all about anxiety. 14 were randomized controlled trials, which sounds great. That's pretty good. This is kind of a gold standard in terms of methodologies. Now, what did they find? Overall, this review suggested that how effective is CBT? Well, according to parent report and according to a clinician's judgment, we have small to maybe moderate effects. So we actually do, compared to waiting for services at least, not compared to another kind of treatment. We actually can make a difference for many people who participate in these kinds of interventions, but not everybody, and actually not according to self-report. When they ask the children about their anxieties or the teens about their anxieties, often that doesn't change over time. And there's challenges with measuring that and maybe challenges with even the perception. What's my takeaway for you is that we actually know a lot about how to help people with autism around anxiety. At least if they're kids or teens, about 8 to 15 years of age. Most interventions are not long, actually. They're about 14 to 16 sessions. That's pretty feasible. But some interventions go as long as 32 sessions. About half to maybe 70% show considerable improvement. That still means that half of the kids that are participating in these trials don't make gains. Right? So these are not, there's not one size fits all here. Okay? There's no one magic bullet. And most of these, if not all of these participants, don't have an intellectual disability. So we know very little about, we know about how to use it. Funny, we know about how to use CBT for people with intellectual disability, and we know about how to use CBT for people with autism, but we haven't actually done many studies, if at all, to look at how we use CBT for people with autism who also have an intellectual disability. So that would be an excellent dissertation topic for any graduate students in the audience. There was one study that looked at anger, even though anger and aggression is such an important issue in this population. One study. And that study was actually, do you see the red book and the green book here at the bottom? Tony Attwood. Who knows Tony Attwood here? You raise your hand. People know Tony Attwood. very famous. So Tony Atwood wrote this Exploring Feelings toolkit for anxiety and Exploring Feelings toolkit for anger, and the only difference is the color of the book and the word anger and the word anxiety. Okay, it's exactly the same set of activities in both. But that's important, right? Well, it's important because one, you shouldn't buy both, but the second reason that it's really important is that the same activities that help a kid with anxiety have been shown to help them with anger. The same activities. If you know how to do one, you know how to do the other. Okay? And maybe emotion regulation, and this is what I'm going to get into, something that we're doing a lot of research on, and we're about to publish an RCT exactly on that, on using CBT for emotion regulation. Now, even beyond CBT, using principles of applied behavioral analysis is well known to address challenging behaviors as well as emotional difficulties in people with developmental disabilities. So let's not forget about the importance of the broader field of trying to understand the functions of behavior and developing ways of targeting and boosting up the positive behaviors in very scientific ways. Now, one of the things I've been passionate about studying is how do we use CBT with a very strong behavioral component to help kids with autism around their emotion regulation skills. So not anxiety specifically. You could have problems with anxiety, anger, sadness, or any mix thereof. Just throw it all together. If we can improve your emotion regulation abilities, you can handle stressful situations, challenges, and minimize any of those kinds of emotions. Okay? So we've been publishing a few things on this topic, and the intervention we've studied is called Secret Agent Society, Operation Regulation. This was developed by Renee Beaumont from the University of Queensland. Secret Agent Society is actually a group intervention, a social skills intervention that has a very strong cognitive and behavioral component. It's very engaging. It's spy-themed, right? So for an 8 to 12-year-old boy on the spectrum, right, to say you're a cadet and we're going to teach you all of these cool spy activities so you can decode social situations, it kind of fits with there's a good hook in there. There's a nice package. Right? Same stuff as a lot of the other trials, but it's just got a nice window dressing to it. So Renee was kind enough to adapt her intervention to make it an individual cognitive behavioral intervention that could boost emotion regulation in kids. So that was the idea. And that's what we studied. Okay? And we just kind of wrapped up our trial. And actually, we just received funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research to expand the trial beyond autism, to use the same intervention for kids with a broad degree of neurodevelopmental conditions. Autism, cerebral palsy, fragile fetal alcohol spectrum issues, learning disabilities, ADHD, or any mix thereof, because we know kids aren't kind of distinct, right, in these kinds of things. So let's see if we can just help kids in general who struggle with challenges. So this is what some of the materials involve. There's a cadet handbook, a parent handbook, teacher handouts, right? There's different kinds of manipulatives, visuals. There's a computer game that's used. I'm not going to train you right now on how to deliver Secret Agent Society. This is a package, right, that's kind of used together. And what did we find? Overall, in our randomized trial, so this is just a teaser at some of the results that we found. One is that, according to Parent Report, we were really able to see differences in those kids that received treatment compared to those who were waiting for treatment and eventually got it, in terms of how well they were able to manage their emotions in social situations. That was probably one of the strongest effects, or the strongest changes between our two groups. So the blue line is kind of our treatment group who got the treatment right away, and the green line is our group that's been waiting for treatment, and will get it afterwards. Okay? I'm not going to show you here what the follow-up data looks like, but whether it's intent to treat or those who completed, it's the same pattern. Okay? We also saw overall, according to clinician judgment, reductions in psychiatric symptoms, so not just emotion regulation, but things like difficulties with anxiety, depression, oppositionality, the kind of broader set of mental health things that parents talk about and that we check off. So we saw kind of an opposite trend where we saw a greater reduction in the group that participated in the intervention. One thing that you're not going to see, but there's a similar kind of pattern for blind clinician judgment. So we had clinicians who looked at reports but didn't know which kids were getting the treatment, which kids weren't getting the treatment, were waiting, and made judgments about levels of improvement. And it turns out that even though they were blind to it, we see the same kind of pattern. So pretty good evidence. We've got this growing evidence. It's encouraging. But there's another set of interventions that we're really interested in looking at, which is mindfulness-based therapy. So we have mindfulness within that CBT trial. So mindfulness-based therapy, so far there have been 6 studies in this systematic review. There's actually more like 9 that exist. We show that in children, mindfulness-based interventions can help boost a kid's ability to manage, kids with autism's ability to manage anxiety or problems with their thoughts, aggression or social responsiveness in teens, and actually reduced anxiety, feelings of depression, and rumination in adults on the spectrum who participate. So good beginning level evidence here. Lots of, and what we've done at York, thanks to funding from Kids Brain Health Network, is we've been able to examine an intervention called My Mind that comes from the Netherlands. So the Dutch love their mindfulness, just like the UK love their census. So we were able to kind of translate and evaluate and also actually provide training to clinicians across Canada in how to do this mindfulness-based therapy. So a few people actually from BC, from Vancouver, came to York and participated in this training. So it's a very low-tech intervention. If you've got a meditation bell, a cushion, and a yoga mat, really and a space, that's what you need, right? It's not very sexy though when you kind of bring in a newspaper crew, a news crew or something like, look at what I do, and there's like a cushion on the floor. But you know, I'd much rather have a genotyping machine to kind of show off. But that's really, it's kind of a low-tech thing, but this is what it looks like, right? And we focus on things like improving youth awareness, teens with autism or young adults with autism. We focus on parents. In this trial, parents come in, they go into one room, and they get their mindfulness for themselves. And the teens and young adults come in, they go to a different room and get mindfulness for themselves. And then they come back together. It's not just about teaching parents how to help their kids. It's about helping parents help themselves. Okay, so we're helping the family here. When you first mention the idea of mindfulness to teens, usually they look at you with some healthy skepticism.
At first I wasn't okay with it, but after a while I think I managed to get used to it. So to the point where I enjoyed it.
That's all about bringing mindfulness to people with developmental disabilities and to their parents.
I was really thinking that it was more something for him, and then what I discovered was that it was also something for me.
When they come, the teens go together into one room, and the parents go together into a different room.
Meditating helps you be calm.
It's not just going to a mindfulness group in the community and everyone has different issues, but somebody who is living a similar experience that you're living through. Having a teenager with ASD.
We teach these teens how to do these mindfulness activities so that they're more aware of themselves, of their thoughts, of their feelings.
It helps me a lot, the breathing space.
So this is a time-limited program. It's 9 sessions, and then we add on a booster session at the end. The logistical aspects of group therapy are beneficial to some because they get that social support, that group experience.
It kind of helped me feel more confident, and as well as make some pretty good friends.
If I was doing it in a small group with other people on the autism spectrum, maybe I would not only feel just as comfortable, if not more so, doing it again, but I would perhaps get better at actually bringing what I've learned to my day-to-day experiences.
I got to meet other autistic peers because I don't really I never really had that much in my community before.
After going through this program, I feel like I've got a lot more solid choices available to me with regards to what I can do.
It's made me a much more calm person.
It's fun, it teaches you how to help yourself calm down.
If he's upset about something and then I get upset as well, it doesn't usually improve the situation.
As a parent, when you become more relaxed, it reflects into relationship with the whole family and the teen.
My son is meeting me and halfway through and we talk about things, and that makes all the difference in the world for me.
We have the ability to evaluate through research, demonstrate the efficacy of cost-effective interventions that don't take that much to scale up, that can have a profound impact.
Well, the program's actually amazing.
I loved it. That was a great decision to do it.
The parents will get something out of this as well and figure out strategies for themselves and how to deal with situations.
I've learned to relax.
I'm thrilled, really thrilled.
Must do no-brainer.
what you don't see there are the negatives that people talk about. And with research, there are negatives associated. We ask people, what didn't you like about the program? And some of those young adults were very vocal about that. That ended up on the cutting room floor, right? So this is not a panacea. It's not perfect, and it still actually can be improved. But that's what research is all about, right? It's not about figuring it out the first time. It's about improving it every time. Okay. Well, there's a lot of things that we can do every time. We improve it all the time. So there's lots of things that for one thing, one of the things that the young adults did not like is the research. Okay, unfortunately, it's part of it, but they did not like having to fill out the surveys, frankly. They thought a lot of the questions were stupid, right? Were irrelevant to their situation. Some of them wrote, you should just be asking me one question. Has this improved my quality of life? I don't understand why you need to be asking this in so many different ways. You're really only asking about quality of life. Right? But there's a very important kind of message in there is how do we measure change? What should we be asking about? The same thing with some of the activities. Some liked some of the activities, some really they didn't like as much. That's what research is good for, and that's why it's important. Right? Before you spend millions of dollars rolling it out across the country, right? You show that it can work, you figure out the best way that it can work and have the best uptake for the most people. Right? So let's go back to some other evidence. We're going to move back to mindfulness a little bit later when we talk about working with the family. In terms of when we talk about mental health problems, we really should acknowledge the role of medication, the important role that medication can play to help people when they're struggling with emotional difficulties. When it comes to autism, there's actually been a number of studies, about 47 trials, according to this systematic review in 2016. 47 studies examined psychotropic medication with people with autism. And what did they find? Well, they suggested that there's some evidence for what they call ASD-related irritability in children and teens. I'm not 100% clear on what ASD-related irritability is, but what it isn't is it isn't the same thing as saying anxiety or aggression or self-injury. Okay? It's very specific, kind of irritability or irritation, I gather. So there's some evidence around that. ADHD medication has been helpful for attentional difficulties in many kids with ASD, but and there's some limited use of evaluation of antidepressants, but very limited use. And this systematic review, as well as the other reviews, all seem to suggest that there's far more work that's needed and that we need to exercise caution when using medications, especially as a first-line intervention or a first-line treatment. That being said, clinically, I certainly can attest to how for some people, medication combined with participating in these kinds of therapies can be very helpful. So it's really not, again, there's no one-size-fits-all or one bullet, but we need to be very cautious about how we examine the use of interventions and the side effects of interventions when we're making these kinds of decisions. So we can work with the individual, right? You guys see how there's some ways we can work with the individual. What about working with contexts? Working with the broader context beyond the individual? Fostering positive people in their lives? Fostering collective activities or the right kinds of opportunities? Positive, safe places? Providing the right kind of institutional resources? These are the ecologies that I was speaking of before. What are we doing right now about this? Well, we know we can work well with families. Okay, and we can help families help themselves and help families help people they care about with autism. Right? I think this is an important quote to consider as we talk about families. The strongest oak of the forest is not one that is protected from the storm and hidden from the sun. It's the one that stands in the open, where it's compelled to struggle for its existence against the winds and the rains. There is tremendous resilience in families. Right? Resilience does not mean you don't struggle. Right? Resilience comes from struggle. It's an important part of life, and it's a reality. But within that, we know that the health of a family interacts with the health of the individuals in the family. We know that if we can support parents before and after their kids develop mental health issues, we'll be at a better place than if we just become reactive and wait until problems emerge. We know that we can foster things like empowerment or psychological acceptance, problem-focused coping, right, if we can give it at the right time to family members. This also involves not just shaping the individual family member or the parent, but making sure there are systems at place where there's the right kind of intensity around respite, or do you call it respite here? The right kind of social support from the right people. You know, in some of our research around social support, families have been very vocal that they don't want tons of informal support from their neighbors and stuff all the time, right? Or family members. Sometimes people want to deal with a problem with their immediate family, and that's it. They don't want to keep it more vocal than that. But what they all say is that when they're asking for support, they want it to be there. Okay. And more than that, we need to figure out the best ways to facilitate the right kind of engagement with broader systems of care, whether we're talking about the school system or a community system or a social system, right? That experiences matter not just for the person, but for their broader family. We did a correlational study many years ago now where we kind of looked at what's the kind of potential buffering effect that families can have, that a family warmth or parental warmth can have if a kid with autism is experiencing bullying. So there's lots of limitations to this work. It was just a correlational study. But what we did was we measured how frequently in the last 2 months a kid with autism was experiencing bullying in their school. So what you see on the bottom line, I'll give you guys the red dot on this side. What you see on, nope. Okay, I'm forgetting about the red dot. That doesn't work. So what you see, actually, let's try it one more time. You see it? Okay. What you see on the bottom is you'll see that there's like from not being bullied to being bullied 2 times per week in the last month. Okay. And what you see for all 3 lines, right, depends, I'll tell you what the lines are in a second, but for all 3 lines, as you go along in terms of being bullied, the higher the lines get, right? Kind of goes up. Okay. And that's kind of the rate of anxiety that's being endorsed. So the more frequent these kids were experiencing bullying, the more severe their endorsed levels of anxiety, which makes sense, right? Bullying is not good, period. But we also ask parents to report on their level of parenting affect, their level of positivity, and the level of negativity that they experience in being parents, because we experience as parents both, right? Stress, anger, happiness, pride, joy, sadness, fear, right? So if we were to measure this, an overall kind of positivity in terms of parenting, and we said, okay, relative to the overall sample, relative to that group, those that reported the lowest levels of parenting warmth, bullying had the strongest influence essentially on the kids' anxiety. And those where in the group that had the relative high levels of parenting warmth, those kids, they still experienced bullying and they still experienced anxiety, but the relationship between anxiety and bullying was weaker. Okay? So bullying is bad, period, right? That's not a question here. But enhancing the warmth and the positive experience by parents could have some form of a buffering effect on that negative stressor. And there's far more sophisticated studies without not looking at autism in the Nordic countries, just like the UK love their census and the Dutch love their mindfulness. For some reason, kind of the Scandinavian countries love their twin studies. So they've done some very sophisticated twin studies looking at the impact of family warmth on the experience of bullying over many years in twins, where one twin experiences the bullying and the other one doesn't, or there's different aspects of warmth for different twins. It's very sophisticated designs, and it's the same kind of pattern. Parents and families matter. One thing that we've been passionate about looking at is understanding families at one extreme of functioning, which is experiences of crisis. Crisis is a very common experience for families of people with autism, and we need to figure out a good way of helping people avoid crisis, but also manage through crisis in a successful way. We consider crisis as an imbalance between the kinds of demands that are placed upon a family, and there are always demands. Child demands, outside demands, life demands, right? Some small, some big. Some chronic, some acute and sudden. So we consider that every family has this kind of balance between the kinds of demands they experience and the kinds of capabilities and resources they have at their disposal. Financial resources, emotional resources, relationship resources. And it's not just about the kinds of resources, support resources that they have. It's about the meaning that they apply to this, the kind of understanding. 2 different families with the same stressors and the same kind of resources, hypothetically, could have very different outcomes in terms of their way that they cope with how they understand what they have, how they appreciate what they have or what they make of what they have. So these kind of factors together, this dynamic way, really speak to how families experience crisis and how they manage through that crisis. When there's an imbalance, when there's more demands, then more capabilities, more resources, we can enter into a period of crisis if we don't have hope. If we lack hope, that's when it often results. But what happens with that crisis is actually, that's not a bad thing necessarily, because crisis helps us to adapt. Crisis can make us a stronger family unit. If we're able to adapt, then we can find greater balance again by dealing with those demands, by bringing in new resources, by changing how we make sense of our situation, as an example. But we have to sometimes help some families to achieve that new balance. We can't put it just on parents to do it alone all the time. And my concern is when we end up with chronic crisis. Right? When people can't, are not able, not given the supports needed to get back to that place of balance. But we can do a lot for families. We can intervene with families. There's actually a lot of data to suggest, a lot of research to suggest that things can be optimistic. So I'm going to present to you a couple of examples of what we can do for families. One is around what we call acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a behavioral intervention that helps a person accept and also their current situation and also commit to the right important kind of goals that are valuable to them. Okay? And we've shown that in small workshops. Blackledge and Hayes did a 2-day workshop for parents of people with autism, kids with autism, and showed that after the workshop that there would be improvements around stress, around how parents manage their own depression, their own symptoms of anxiety. There's also mindful parenting, where you can kind of the my mind thing that we were doing before, where we can teach parents to experience their parenting in a way where they approach it with a sense of not judging themselves, not being hard on themselves, understanding how they can care for themselves, and at the same time realize that it's not all roses. Okay? So I'm going to show you a couple of movies now to kind of give you a glimpse of what we can do to help families. We published a recent trial in an RCT where we gave parents, myself as well, led by Dr. Yona Lunsky at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, we gave parents of adults with developmental disabilities, 44% of whom had autism, who were waiting for services. These were all families who were waiting for adult services, right? And I'm sure that's a problem here, just like it is like in Ontario. Families, this is the adult sector, the kids were like 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and so on, and they're deemed eligible for services. It says, congratulations, your adult child can get services, but you need to wait 6 months, right? So this was the kind of group of parents that we delivered one of 2 interventions to, either a mindfulness-based intervention, where we taught actually other parents to be the therapists, just like Elizabeth Dykins did from Vanderbilt, or an information and support intervention where we actually gave them usable information about how to navigate this adult system, what you can do about it. So both really important things, okay? So let me show you, I'll show you a video of the findings. Suffice it to say is that we actually realized we could, the result is that the group that was in both groups had satisfaction, about high levels of satisfaction, but the group that did the mindfulness had greater reductions in their own depression and their stress over the course of the intervention and at 20-week follow-up. So this is an example this is not one that I did, but Dr. Yona Lunsky and Dr. Kenneth Fung in Toronto have led a number of acceptance and commitment therapy interventions to help mothers of children with autism. And so let's just watch them and what they do.
It's a mindfulness-based psychological intervention. It helps us increase our resilience to face difficult thoughts and feelings and emotions while becoming more effective in our lives in being focused and leading a more value-driven life.
Relearn who you are and what you want out of your life, you know, the life you want to have versus the life you don't want to have, and then taking that time and that moment to slow down, reconnect with yourself, feel what it feels like to be you.
ACT is a reservoir of hope for me. It really holds a different way of viewing my thoughts and viewing my child and viewing myself.
You tend to focus all your energy on them and their well-being, and even members of the family when they come around. It's always about how is the child, how is he doing? and you forget to pay attention to things that are going on with you.
And thinking about your child all the time, or if fear takes an upper hand, you lose your values, or you can get sidetracked off your values. I felt like a cup that was completely filled to the brim, and it only took one extra drop to sort of spill over.
When my health goes down, when I'm emotionally not available for my kids or my family, everyone else is affected.
Let me hold it for you.
Oh, sure.
This has given me a very beautiful outlet to try other things to cope with the stress.
It's a very positive experience and provides hope. This group is very empowering to moms. So you end up feeling more in control of your life, and that makes you more effective in dealing with your family. It makes you a better caregiver.
The number one most important thing that has come out of this workshop for me is my awareness of my own health, and that this workshop has taught me to put my own health front and center and to be proactive in keeping myself mentally healthy, emotionally healthy, physically healthy.
It is kind of special to have groups where everyone are parents of children with autism. As soon as you find that out, you feel an instant kind of connection. There's almost a different language you would use.
I'm inspired by the resilience of the parents and their openness, and it takes courage.
As a parent and as a facilitator, as much as I am teaching the knowledge I've learned or I've gained, I'm receiving it back from these women as well. And it's been a privilege to be able to facilitate and learn more, but also get back the strength and the courage and the empowerment that I get from each of them.
So we can empower parents to help parents in a scientifically validated way, in a time-limited way. Right? I'm kind of talking myself out of a job. Right? Like, you don't need to be a clinical psychologist, right? Separate from, we can actually work together as a community to create the best helping community that we can have. Okay? I thought about showing one other video. Is it okay if I show one other video? So this is kind of the mindfulness intervention for parents of adults. I'm trying to also convey, granted, across the life course here, right? This is not just about kids. It's also not just all about mindfulness. I'm just sharing with you the kinds of interventions that we've been doing and studying and that I'm a part of, well, because that's what I know best. But the really important part is to convince you that as a community, we can support families and we can study actually how to best do that.
We wanted to offer something to families here in Ontario who have requested services from Developmental Services Ontario before they get those services as a way to help them sort of manage their own stress and cope as best they can with their son or their daughter, sort of in that interim period, maybe when they don't have all the supports in place that they need or that they would like.
Because a lot of the stress comes to the parents when their child becomes an adult. That's when it all starts. I mean, up until then, you've got school and different programs that are there available. But once your child turns 21, you really have to be connected, or it's pretty difficult.
Being with parents in this environment where they're talking about the stresses of being a parent of someone with a disability, and doing the mindfulness practice combined with that, and it brings parents together in a way where they're doing self-care, which they're so not used to doing.
It helps them in terms of their interactions with their children, and it also helps them cope with ongoing stress that can't in itself be immediately fixed or resolved. Third, it might be helping parents in terms of how they're interacting with the other parents in the group, as well as how they're interacting with people in their daily lives, so that they're feeling better and managing their stress better. So in fact, while all groups for parents might be helpful to some extent, or parents might say, I like being in a group, sort of those long-term changes are more likely with parents when they learn mindfulness skills.
I feel that parents are looking for a more streamlined approach to navigating the services. We want to hear from other parents who have learned about options that are not always readily available. I think we need a place to discuss the actual issues, because parenting a child, an adult child, is very different than parenting a younger child. And I think we need self-care. I think that's why the mindfulness really spoke to me, more than, say, a group just to learn more about services. That would have been helpful, but not necessarily healing. I felt this was a combination of both.
So I think that's really a powerful last statement. Helpful but not healing. And we probably need both, right? We need helpful and we need healing. Okay? So I've convinced you that we can work with kids, we can work with people with autism, we can work with their family members, with parents, to boost their mental health, and in so doing, support the larger family unit. What about beyond the family? For the last 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about that. I'll be around afterwards if you want to chat and if you have questions about this. But what about beyond the family? Okay. Well, when it comes to peers and working with peers, we know that social inclusion, so meaningful social inclusion, which includes the experience of belonging while participating in meaningful activities, is something that can be very challenging for many people on the spectrum. The work by Connie Kasari, where she's followed children through elementary school, through many grades, and she studied the kind of friendships they make, the kind of interactions, the peer interactions and the peer dynamics that happen, shows that within those inclusive settings, as the kids get older, as they go into older and older grades, they're less likely to be accepted, less likely to show reciprocal friendships, and they're more likely to be isolated or to be on the periphery of a social network. So they're still on the social network, but they're on the outsides of the social network. But it doesn't have to be that way. One of the suggestions, for example, was promoting children with ASD skills in popular activities to share with peers in early childhood may be a key preventative intervention for the later isolation they observed. What does she mean by this? One important point here is that they didn't say promoting children with ASD social skills, period. They said promoting children with ASD skills in popular activities. Right? Think about the popular activities. They're going to be different ones, right? But think about all the activities that people with autism want to be engaged in, that we can start with and we can expand and bridge from to make those kinds of connections. If we think about that early on, we don't want to extinguish those key interests. We want to capitalize on them. We want to use them in the best possible way. It's not just about young kids, though. There's a lot of mentorship programs that have popped up across the country, across North America actually, to support university students on the spectrum. So it's on the kind of the other end of fostering social connections with peers. Whether I know Simon Fraser has one, I just heard that UBC has one. York University has pioneered kind of a manual. I'm not involved in the writing of it, but I'm very happy that York has done this. Created different kinds of mentorship programs. They all look different, and there's actually very little science behind them, but there's a reason why they've popped up so often, they've proliferated, is that university students are asking for that kind of connection. So we can do a lot with this to make sure that there are positive opportunities around social connections across the life course. But what it's going to look like is not just providing social skills training to the person with autism. Right? That's not what it's about. It's about creating the kind of opportunities where people can connect with other people. And sometimes that involves structure and guidance and support. I'm going to show you the coolest intervention, last video, coolest intervention of the whole bunch, okay? And then we'll kind of wrap up again, okay? But this one, just hold on, okay? This speaks to, I know people are excited. Karen at the back is like, oh my gosh, right? This intervention is about creating an interaction between an individual and their community, a positive interaction that has a profound impact on their mental health, on their social skill development, on their place within that community, in a way that without the intervention, they wouldn't have had. Ready?
Well, it is a common sight at high school games across the country. A student dressed up as the mascot working the crowd. But what Nevada's mascot has been able to do is anything but ordinary. Here's tonight's Sunday Sports Extra. On Friday nights, just about the only thing that attracts more attention than the camera guy is the mascot. And the Nevada Cub has the roll down pat. They love him. Well, all right, not everybody. He spreads joy all night, but the biggest smile is happening inside the mask. And it belongs to senior Caleb Popejoy.
He's autistic. He has autism. He was antisocial. He had a hard time being in crowds of people.
I think it was when we started middle school. He was terrified just to walk into a big crowd in the gym when school started. A group like this would have scared him.
So you can imagine Mom and Dad's shock when Caleb had an idea his freshman year.
He seen the mask at the school office and took an interest in it. I kept thinking about other mascots. I dressed up in them.
It was worrisome. We were there right by his side when he first did it because we thought he was going to be nervous.
Instead,
coming out here and giving people high fives and giving them hugs.
Why you want to do it? Being the mascot has really brought out his social side. It's allowed him to express what he couldn't otherwise since he's behind the mask.
you got some moves down?
Yeah.
No doubt about it, the costume gave Caleb courage here in Nevada. But then a funny thing happened. When he took the costume off, he realized he didn't even need it.
He's gotten used to people now. He can greet people. He can talk to people. He's not afraid of crowds anymore.
I feel excited and happy.
Despite autism's social and emotional challenges, this cub has matured. Tell me how proud you are and how far he's been able to go.
Oh gosh.
Oh, the hard question.
Yeah.
To me, he seems like a new child.
Yeah.
He's not the same kid he was when he started high school.
And so it's not about mascot therapy, okay? But this is a particular example for this one person where the right opportunity was there. In that community, that's valued, right? In Friday Night Lights, in that community, that's a high school football game, and the community shows up. In Toronto, nobody shows up to a high school football. It would not be the right meaningful environment, right? Not necessarily, not in the same way to have that same kind of profound impact. But it's the intersection between the right community with those values and that interest and the right opportunity with the support, right? That makes a difference for that individual. That's a mental health intervention. It's just not delivered by, a psychologist, by a therapist. But that matters. So if you have a role to play in fostering those kinds of opportunities, you're mental health interventionists. I'm going to wait until the end, okay? So, whether it's that, you could Google, there's tons of examples, or Scouts as another example, but what these things have in common is there's the right fit, the right alignment between the person's needs and strengths and those opportunities. You can't just throw everybody into Scouts and expect it to work, okay? It has to be the right fit. That's what the positive youth development is really about, the alignment between the two. But we know it works. It's not just about people who don't have intellectual disability either. A lot of our research has involved people with intellectual disabilities, studying different kinds of programs, different kinds of opportunities. And we've seen the same thing, whether it means working in a library or in a coffee shop or something like Special Olympics, where we've been able to show that involvement in Special Olympics is associated with a lot of growth, a lot of positive growth over time. We did a photo study where we equipped young athletes in Special Olympics with disposable cameras, and we taught them how to use those cameras, and we told them to go back out and take pictures of what matters to them. We taught them about how to, literally we had to teach them how to use it, because now they just click their phone, right, and record it. So we actually had to, you turn this thing, and there's only one click per, you don't waste it on like selfies of your face, right? You only have 28 shots. Right, because then they mailed them back in, and we developed them, then we brought them back in, and we had them sort them out, the different pictures, and then talk about it. But these were young people who really struggled with communicating with words, which is why we wanted to provide the other way of trying to do that. And so much, the vast majority of the pictures were not about the medals, they were not about the equipment, They weren't at all about family. Parents were not in that at all for these young people. It was about their goofing around with their peers. Right? And of course, like, that makes total sense, right? But it speaks to the value not of the actual activity, but what that activity means to that person. So could mental health be fostered by by recreation programs? Do you even need cognitive behavior therapy at all? Well, one study, the last RCT I'm going to talk to you about, last study, randomly assigned teens on the spectrum to either a structured cognitive behavior therapy group for anxiety, like one of those manuals I showed you, where they went through structured emotion kind of discussions and systematic approaches to feared stimuli and all of these very technical pieces, or the teens had to participate in another group, a social recreation program. It's still same structure, same number of hours per week, facilitators were there, right? Same rules on the board, all of those things were there, but there was no cognitive behavior therapy to systematically address their anxiety. They all had anxiety. They were randomly assigned. Okay? They participated for about the same amount, like same amounts of attendance, enjoyment in the different activities, right? They liked both groups. And they actually found no difference in the degree of change in anxiety between the two groups, right? Whether they were in the CBT group or in the social recreation program, about 50 to 60% of the participants in both groups showed clinically meaningful improvements in anxiety at the end of the group and at follow-up. Did everybody improve in either group? No. It really speaks to the fact, I think, that it's not a one-size-fits-all. Some people benefited from the social rec program. Some people benefited from the CBT. Maybe if they had both, we'd have higher numbers. I don't know. But the fact is that there was not a stronger effect on anxiety in the CBT program than there was in a well-structured, well-oiled social recreation program where teens did teen stuff, video games, movie night, right, sleepovers, things like that. We have an opportunity. You don't have to be a psychologist. I seriously have convinced you right now, eh? The point is that we are empowered as a community to do something about it. That's what this data says. We can also, lastly, foster opportunities beyond any kind of therapy trial to successful, meaningful outcomes in the community, and that matters. Julie Luns-Taylor and others have, for example, spent a lot of time focused on post-secondary outcomes. After high school, what happens to people on the spectrum? One of the things they created was this vocational index. There's so many different potential kind of job outcomes, from something like no vocational or no post-secondary educational activities, perhaps sheltered settings, but less than 10 hours a week, perhaps completely independent settings for more than 10 hours a week. And they're able to kind of look at where people lie after high school and what predicts where they line up. Should everybody be in full-time employment all the time? Probably not, right? But we can shift people. We know that we can move people up this scale, so to speak, right? Empowering them to reach a certain level of independence that matters to them, that's meaningful to them in the right context. What's really interesting is that Julie Luns-Taylor also did a longitudinal study where she asked the question, essentially, what changes first? Okay? A lot of times people come in with anxiety to these kinds of vocational programs, right? And they struggle to, say, reach vocational achievement, people say, because of their anxiety. Do you have to treat the anxiety first so that they can be successful in employment? Or if you make sure they're successful in employment, does their anxiety go down? Or both, right? And what they actually found was that successful employment led to reductions in anxiety over time. Reductions in anxiety did not lead to successful employment over time. Maybe there's issues with how we make sure people have successful employment. But what's clear in that is that if we can establish, we don't have to necessarily deal with all anxiety first before we can have success in treating in employment settings or in the gains in reductions in anxiety. Okay? Lots of different kinds of support programs to help people find the right fit around secondary and post-secondary opportunities. So, where do we go from here? Do we focus on the individual, on the family, on broader environments, or do we all have a role to play in terms of how we shape society when it comes to making sure we live in a society that supports people who are different, period, regardless of label? I would suggest to you that I've shown you at least enough data in an hour and a half to convince you that we can have achievements in all of these kind of corners as a collective group. Right? And by doing so, that's when we're really going to shift the mark on addressing mental health problems or boosting people in that other direction of positive, pro-social mental health thriving. Okay. So that being said, I've kind of held you for most of the time. For the next 3 months, 2-3 months, I'll acknowledge kind of the chair in ASD treatment and care research, which has funded a lot of this work and kind of the opportunity to speak across the country, and I'm proud to be able to hold that role, and all of the partners that have been involved in the chair. If you do want to follow up afterwards, just a couple of plugs. We started an ASD mental health blog that you can Google. There's very few things that pop up if you Google ASD mental health blog, right? So feel free to check out the different kinds of summaries that we have up there, editorials, videos, all about ASD and mental health, if you like topics like what you heard tonight. You can also look at our TEDx videos, our TEDx York U videos. Everybody here has heard of TED Talks before, I'm sure. So we created, the last 2 years as part of this chair, we cultivated a set of TEDx, independently run TED Talks, of people from across Canada who have come and gave TED Talks. So those are also online and you can check them out, including Sergio Cuquia from this center who recently came out and spoke. But we've had people with autism, parents, service providers, advocates, and researchers too on there. So feel free to check those out, okay? You can also kind of follow me on Twitter if you're interested. I always find I delegitimize what I say when I say tweet, but I'm on there too, so feel free to reach out, okay, and follow. All right, thanks very much for your attention, everybody, and have a great night.